Bartimaeus, a blind man, the son of Timaeus, sat by the roadside begging. On hearing that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have pity on me." And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he kept calling out all the more, "Son of David, have pity on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take courage, get up, Jesus is calling you." He threw aside his cloak, sprang up, and came to Jesus. Jesus said to him in reply, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man replied to him, "Master, I want to see." Jesus told him, "Go your way. Your faith has saved you." Immediately he received his sight and followed him on the way. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus. Over this past liturgical year, a year that's going to be coming to an end in just about a month, we have been reading through the Gospel of Mark. And there are a couple of things that really stand out. And I think one of the most remarkable things is something that we heard in today's Gospel. Perhaps you know that in Mark's Gospel, Jesus is portrayed as being on the move, even at a breathtaking pace. The word immediately, by my count, is used 35 times in Mark's short Gospel. That's almost half the number of times that word immediately is used in the entire New Testament. And this action-packed pace of Mark's Gospel points to a sense of urgency on the part of Jesus as he continues his mission, his journey to Jerusalem. So, what was it that was so remarkable in today's reading? Two words, really. Words that just seem to leap off the page at us. It's when Mark's Gospel said, Jesus stopped. Because in Mark's Gospel, Jesus never stops. He is going on the move, except here. Here, Jesus stops. And why does he do that? Because a blind beggar on the side of the road is calling out to him for mercy. Another related theme that appears over and over again in Mark's Gospel is that the disciples of Jesus are in many ways portrayed as blind, as being unable to see what was right before their eyes, and it's because they were hard of heart. When Mark tells us about the story of Jesus and the miracle of Jesus and the multiplication of the loaves and the fish, he says that the disciples did not understand what that was all about. Why? He says because their hearts were hardened. Jesus later says to his disciples, "Do you not yet understand or comprehend? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and not see? Ears and not hear?" I think Mark's entire gospel can be reduced to one basic question: who can see and who fails to see? The scribes and the Pharisees that Jesus encounters throughout the gospel, they claim to see, but their way of seeing is very different. They see Jesus with disdain. They want to kill him. Why? Because he associates with sinners. No, they see the sinner, but they fail to see the sick person in need of healing. So they fail to see Jesus as the one who came to save sinners. For example, earlier in Mark's Gospel, when Jesus heals the man with the withered hand, the withered arm, he does that on the Sabbath. And the scribes and the Pharisees are appalled that he would dare heal someone on the Sabbath. Their hearts were hardened. Their hearts were closed to mercy. And the Gospel tells us that Jesus looked at them in anger, saddened by the hardness of their hearts. These are sobering words because they could just as well apply to any of us. I don't think you need me to tell you there are a lot of hard hearts in the world today. The scribes and the Pharisees, yes, they could see, but they only saw what they wanted to see, and then turned a blind eye to what they didn't want to see. So, in a certain sense, the words of Jesus bring sight, seeing, while for others they cause a certain type of blindness, a spiritual blindness. And that's as true today as it was some 2,000 years ago. What do we see? We see so that we can follow the way. We could know the way. In the gospel, seeing leads to discipleship. But to be a disciple of Jesus means to go the way of the cross. To go and follow Jesus on the way to Calvary. And who does Mark give us as a model of discipleship? A blind man who sits on the side of the road begging. Bartimaeus probably heard that Jesus was going to be passing by on that busy, famous road that led from Jericho to Jerusalem. And although he couldn't literally see Jesus, he heard about him, and he wanted to at least be in the presence of Jesus, if only for a few moments as Jesus passed by. But as Jesus does pass by, he begins to shout out, "Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me." Though he's blind, he sees, but he sees with the eyes of faith. And he cries out to Jesus for mercy. And it doesn't go all that well. It's not so easy for Bartimaeus. As he cries out, many of those around him, it tells us, I'm sure many of those who are disciples of Jesus, they basically tell him to shut up. But Bartimaeus only shouts louder, "Son of David, have pity on me." Those wanting to silence Bartimaeus, they were the ones in the blind. If they could truly see, they too would be shouting out to Jesus, "Son of David, have pity on me." And what a remarkable testament to the faith of Bartimaeus. He calls Jesus the Son of David, King David, the great King David, from whom the Messiah would be a descendant. Bartimaeus, in calling Jesus Son of David, is recognizing him as that long-awaited Messiah who would save not only Israel, but all people. He was the one that Jeremiah talked about in our first reading, the one of whom it said, the will of the Lord shall be accomplished. Jeremiah said that when he comes, he will gather the exiles from the ends of the world with the blind and the lame. So, basically, Bartimaeus is shouting, Savior, save me, have mercy on me. And yet, the disciples want to know better. They tell Bartimaeus to keep silent. After all, Bartimaeus is nothing but a blind beggar, a nuisance. The disciples of Jesus treat Bartimaeus the way so many of us, and I'm talking about myself too, often treat the poor and the homeless today, trying to get them to be quiet and maybe hopefully to go away. But we don't have to look at them. We don't have to see them. But Bartimaeus doesn't go away. He only shouts louder, Savior, save me, have mercy on me. Bartimaeus has a faith that simply doesn't give up. He doesn't get discouraged when others try to silence him. The gospel said he kept calling out all the more. And then Jesus says to the disciples, call him. Of course, Jesus could have called Bartimaeus himself, but he wants the ones who are trying to silence Bartimaeus to be the ones to call him. Jesus did not gather his disciples around him to be his bodyguards or to shield him from the cries of the poor. He knows that his disciples, their hearts are hardened and they must change their attitude and understand that they cannot be disciples of Jesus and follow him with hardness of heart. And when the disciples tell Bartimaeus Jesus is calling, he doesn't waste a moment. It says he sprang up, threw off his cloak, and came to Jesus. You know, just to do that, to toss off his cloak, is no small thing for a beggar like Bartimaeus to do. I once remember seeing a man accidentally bump into the bed, just the bed of a homeless woman. Accidentally just brushed into it. And her reaction was one of extreme agitation. She came out swinging and cursing, protecting that bed with this poor shop man. I was trying to say, I'm sorry for bumping into you. I didn't mean it. Like that woman's bed, that cloak, may have been all that Bartimaeus had in this world. It was his shelter and his protection. Not just his shelter from those cold nights, but shelter, protection for him to keep some shred of his dignity, to maybe hide himself under that cloak as he would stick out his hand in hopes that he would receive a little bit of something in charity. Yet Bartimaeus tosses that cloak aside, freeing himself from that obstacle that might slow him down. And it does cause me to ask, what obstacles do I have in my life that slow me down, that keep me from just running to Jesus and being a disciple as fast as I can? And then Jesus asks him, I think, a rather strange question. He says, what do you want me to do for you? Well, odd question. I mean, if it were today, Bartimaeus would probably say something like, duh, I'm a blind beggar, you're a miracle worker, heal me. Pause there for a minute and recall the words we heard heard in last week's gospel, when the apostles James and John go to Jesus and say, "We want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." That is not a very smart approach to take when you're talking to God, to tell him what he's going to do for you. Bartimaeus doesn't do that. He stays on the side of the road, and recognizing his poverty, he simply says, "Have pity on me." Nor is he like Peter, whose story we heard in Mark's Gospel, who got in front of Jesus and rebuked Jesus when Jesus said what he was about to do, so that Jesus had to in turn rebuke Peter and say, "Get behind me, Satan." There's a big difference between those disciples, Peter, James, and John, and Bartimaeus, at least at this point in the disciples' journey. And now those same disciples who told Bartimaeus to keep quiet are now telling him, have courage, take heart, Jesus is calling you, get up. And so then Jesus says to Bartimaeus, "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus knew what Bartimaeus wanted, yet he wanted him to ask. He placed the initiative on him. Just like we need to ask, we need to pray. And Bartimaeus very simply says, "Master, I want to see." At first, it always gets to me, Master is a poor translation here. Mark actually keeps the Aramaic word, and Bartimaeus calls Jesus Rabboni. Not rabbi. Rabbi means teacher. He calls him Rabboni, which means my teacher. He calls him my teacher. He addresses Jesus on a personal, intimate level. Not as a stranger, not as an anonymous nobody, but as someone who Jesus knows. My teacher. And then finally, notice that Jesus doesn't do anything. And that's because everything necessary for the miracle to occur is already in place. It's Bartimaeus' faith that brings him salvation. And all Jesus says is, "Go on your way, your faith has saved you." And the gospel ends by telling us that immediately, there's that word again, immediately Bartimaeus received his sight and followed Jesus on the way. Notice, Jesus tells Bartimaeus to go your way, but Bartimaeus follows Jesus on his way. His way is the way of the cross, the way that leads to Calvary, that leads to the resurrection. Mark gives us Bartimaeus as an icon of a true disciple, by someone who just calls out in faith, "Lord, have mercy on me." Bartimaeus, a poor blind beggar, in one sense already sees. He sees with these eyes of faith, with the sight of faith, and in doing so receives not only his sight, but the one treasure he is not willing to lose, Jesus, who he follows on his way, the way of Jesus. I hope we all understand that every single one of us here is a blind beggar. Yes? I don't care if the Pope were here. Is the Pope here? I don't see him. If the Pope was here, he too is with us in that he is a blind beggar. And why are we blind? Well, the saints tell us, St. Thomas Aquinas tells us, What makes us blind is sin. St. Thomas says that sin darkens the intellect and weakens the will. It acts as a veil over our face. It blinds us. So, ask yourself the question, why did I come here today? That I came because I had to? Is it because you heard that Jesus would be here at this liturgy? We won't literally see Jesus like Bartimaeus at first didn't see Jesus with his eyes, but Bartimaeus heard about Jesus from others as we do, and from the liturgy of the Word that we celebrate here. Are you here because you want Jesus to stop and say to you, what do you want me to do for you? If so, we must become like Bartimaeus. We must acknowledge our hardness of heart and eliminate it and recognize that we are nothing more than blind beggars. Ask yourself that question. Where am I on my first faith journey? Do I see, or do I just think I see? What if Jesus would say to you, what do you want me to do for you? What would you say? Would you want him to put his stamp of approval on your agenda? Or would you make his agenda your agenda? Would you be like Peter and tell him, I have a better plan if only you would stop and listen to me? Or am I like Bartimaeus? Do I recognize my blindness, my poverty, my wretchedness, and cry out, just as we do at the beginning of every Mass, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. We must approach this sacred liturgy as blind beggars who want to see. And so first and foremost, we, like Bartimaeus, must cry out for mercy and forgiveness. Beg for mercy so that when Jesus comes, he will come. He will be here today, that we will be able to see him with the eyes of faith. And at Holy Communion, hear that same call. Get up, take courage. Jesus is calling you. As with Bartimaeus, this Eucharistic encounter with Jesus is calling us to live in a new way, his way, to eliminate any hardness of heart, because Jesus will be here today. He will call you to follow him on the way to Calvary, which leads to the resurrection. He's going to call you to do that. What will you say?